doing that is no two places have been affected the same way. No two sectors have been affected the same way. No two regions of the state have been affected the same way. So anything that you try to do, you being the legislature potentially or the governor, is going to, in my opinion, need to be targeted. Because one, you actually work with local units that understand the makeup of those places, and two, the industrial structure, meaning the types of businesses, sectors that exist in a particular region, are driving to a large extent how exposed or unexposed that region is to the devastation that was caused by COVID. In case you get bored and you decide to leave, I'm just going to summarize for you what I'm going to tell you. And this is a snapshot, essentially. As of February, that's the last month for which we have complete data. That's a month ago, or a little more than a month ago. We're running at about 22,000 jobs below February of last year. Big numbers, obviously. That's a little over 7%. As I've said a second ago, the losses vary by region, income group, sector, and even within sector. For those of you that want a lot more detail, everything that's in blue in the presentation takes you to a link. When I say in my forecast is in blue, that takes you to a detailed forecast that I produced, well, almost a year ago now. That does a forecast for the next 2.5 years, sector by sector, and for the economy as a whole. Just for context and to determine whether or not you want to kind of pay attention to what I'm saying or believe me or not. The forecast for last year that I produced in June ended up being very, very close to how we ended up the year, meaning I forecasted that we were going to end up at about 7.5% below 2019 levels. That's exactly where we were. Forecasted, obviously, massive losses in leisure and hospitality. That's what we saw. Smaller losses in healthcare. That's essentially what we saw. So I think that gives me a little bit of confidence that some of the assumptions that I made in producing the forecast essentially ended up playing out that way. Now, of course, we have some tailwinds and some headwinds that have emerged since, and I'll discuss those. The third bullet point says something that I think is incredibly important, and I think is going to weigh on how some of this federal money is going to end up being spent, which is that personal income. That's, again, overall income that's floating in the economy, or that households have, or that proprietors have, and that includes wages, that includes dividends, that includes interest, but importantly, it includes transfers from the federal government. When you add all of that personal income up, these are statistics, by the way, that are produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They get produced for every state. They're estimates. They're not perfect, but they're incredibly useful and important. When you add all of that up, you find that personal income in the state has actually gone up relative to last year. Now, a lot of us see something like this and you have to scratch your head and go, how in the world is that possible? You just told me that there are 22,000 jobs fewer than 2019. Very simply, the amount of federal aid that has entered Alaska has dwarfed the losses that have occurred when it comes to wages or to earnings. And so really that's the story. And then when you basically step back and say, what can I remove these federal transfers to understand what's going on? You can turn to gross domestic product. Again, statistic produced by the BEA, just released 2 weeks ago, shows you that when you think about the value produced by businesses, we're still well below last year. We're about $2.5 billion below. When I say last year, now I'm talking 2020 relative to 2019, and that's almost 5% below the previous year. So that's the very, very, very macro picture. One thing I get asked about, I get these emails on a semi-regular basis, is tell me how much of an effect did the $1,000 stimulus have on this particular community? And I'm sorry to disappoint, but it's near impossible to isolate any one individual program. One, because the tools that we have, meaning whether you use a fancy econometrics model or an input-output or a DSGE, are going to be making assumptions about how people are spending money. And obviously, we're in the middle of the pandemic. Spending patterns have changed. Savings behaviors have changed drastically. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But we have some research. Some researchers have gotten their hands on incredibly granular data that allows them to kind of tease out some aspects of these programs. And so I'll share those with you. Caveats: some of the work is not directly from Alaska, and some of it is not consistent across papers. So we just have to be careful in not latching on to any one piece of news or any one anecdote or any one research paper that says, oh, look, they're telling us that we should give everybody $5,000 and the pandemic will be over. And that's just an example. And then, of course, the last point is, while some of the data that I'm sharing is very new, we just got $1 billion for the state, $200 million for local governments. Some of the stimulus payments are still hitting bank accounts, meaning the third round of stimulus payments are still hitting bank accounts. And so you've got to think about the fact that much of this money has yet to hit the streets, if you will. And so we don't quite understand to what extent it's going to be shifting economic behaviors. And obviously we're all getting vaccinated, or most of us are getting vaccinated, and so the reopening is going reasonably well. So there is some optimism, there is some pent-up demand, there is a high level of savings, and people are excited about that. But then you have the fact that we have this big question mark over the tourism season. In my forecast that I produced last year, I was assuming a near normalization of travel in 2021, meaning this upcoming season. And so as a result of that, I was forecasting that the state economy was going to grow at about 2% from very low levels, but it was going to grow. I still think we're going to grow because we are operating from a very low level. However, if we are to miss out on this second tourism season, then I'm going to have to revise that forecast downward. So I'm on slide 3, and I like this graph that I produce. It's ugly, but I think it communicates the pain that the economy is feeling. I think that, to me, so again, just to be clear, red is bad, green is good. Every month is compared to the same month the previous year. So I'm going to pick on, for example, construction. When you see that construction was up 4% in February 2020, that means that relative to February 2019, construction was, employment in construction in Alaska was 4% higher. And so same thing for every bar for every month. So a couple of just kind of high level remarks here. The pandemic has affected every sector, right? And so you see red across the board, but you see considerable variation across sectors, meaning not every sector felt the pain the same way. Not every sector has recovered. In fact, most sectors have yet to recover. Federal government was the only sector where we saw some green, partially because of the census, but essentially it's flat. Healthcare, that's education and healthcare, that's a super sector that has mainly healthcare and some private education, is really the sector that's nearing those pre-pandemic levels. And that's not super surprising because, again, we had some hospital closures, people were hesitant about going back. We saw layoffs, fairly sharp layoffs, right around that April, May point, and then we saw a recovery. In most other sectors, we're well below pre-pandemic levels. Mining and logging, which is mainly oil and gas, just has not recovered at all. We obviously have had a bit of recovery in prices. Jobs just have not followed, right? And so we're now running at about, as of the latest numbers, we're at 6,300 jobs in oil and gas. That's about a little more than 4,000 jobs, a little more than 4,000 fewer jobs than we had last year. And one thing that I want to point out is that some of you may be looking at the steepness, if you will, of the curve and say, well, things, I'm going to squint and say that things are getting better. One thing I will caution is that You all know this better than I, but Alaska is massively seasonal, meaning we get a lot more jobs during the summer. And so there are about 15% more jobs in the summer, June, July, and August than there are in January. So our losses ballooned over the summer and then shrunk back down in the fall and the winter. That doesn't mean things were getting better. It just means that we were losing or had fewer jobs in the economy. So the reason that I'm harping on this is that if we are to miss out on the tourism season, one thing you will see is, again, losses start to balloon in a few of the sectors that are most sensitive to tourism spending. And so, again, to me, I summarize it in a very technical term and say the labor market is incredibly ugly. And really, there are no great signs, unfortunately, of an organic recovery or of things basically getting back to normal. And so that's kind of the worrisome part. And the economy has taken a backseat to budgetary problems. But I mean, you look at this and it's very hard to interpret this as things have gotten better, or that there are these signs that we're turning the corner, at least for me. So same type of statistic, but now I pivot and I say, well, Alaska is comprised of many communities. As I've said, different industrial structure, different drivers, economic drivers. And as I was hinting a little while ago, while the pandemic has affected every sector, it has not affected any two sectors the same way. Similarly, no two regions of the state have been affected the same way. So this is basically now looking at regions of the state as defined by the Department of Labor. And again, same thing, each month relative to the same month in the previous year. And again, you see that every region of the state is down, but there is significant variation because of exposure to sectors that have been hit the hardest. And again, the question mark is, we're in February. If you were to fast forward 4 months, what will this picture look like if we miss out on that tourism season? And one thing I will note, and I'll show it in the next slide, if you look at the northern region, for example, it's 23% below February of last year, but there is massive variation in how the North Slope is doing and how the Northwest Arctic Borough is doing. Most of these losses, actually almost all of these losses, are driven by the North Slope and not the Northwest Arctic. And that's the case if you go region by region. Once you start and peeling the onion, you start seeing even more of this heterogeneity or variation or difference in exposure. And that's why I keep repeating that, to me, if we're thinking about aid, you have to target, meaning you have to think really carefully about who needs help and how can we help and what type of help, because not everybody is experiencing this pandemic the same way. And so this is basically, so here, these are February numbers. Unfortunately, we do not get borough level employment numbers that are released every month. And so I'm going backwards in time here, but I'm just decomposing the picture at the borough level. The last month for which we have complete data at the borough level is September. But it still gives you a sense of, again, the massive variation across places. One, that it's ugly in a lot of places, and two, that if you had to guess, close your eyes and guess, you probably would have guessed that tourism dependent communities are the ones that are struggling the most. And as you can see on the left on the left side of the graph, Denali and Skagway are basically 60%, or in September, they had 60% fewer jobs than they did the previous year. And so, again, this is just based off of last year's numbers. So we have that big question mark about how many of these communities are going to be able to potentially withstand a second season without visitors, and how many businesses. This is just something that I think about, which is We want as many businesses to survive, to be here on the other side of the pandemic, because that's what's going to determine hiring levels, demand for employees, and the question about how many people or how many businesses are there to potentially absorb new employees is a big one. We unfortunately don't have great statistics about how many businesses have failed. We have some surveys, but they're imperfect. And so, yeah, so that's what the labor market looks like. I'm going to go through these things fairly quickly in the interest of time, but this is a slightly different picture that I like showing, which is not employment, but unemployment claims. This is initial unemployment claims. And so these are newly filed claims for unemployment insurance. And so think about them as people essentially wanting to receive unemployment insurance. And as you can see, I have a little bit of data from before the pandemic. Super boring series, really does not fluctuate a whole lot, hovers around 900 claims filed per week. And then we see this hockey stick here jumps to almost 15,000. And then I have these two vertical lines because I'm going to talk about stimulus payments in a little bit. And then you see declines in these unemployment claims. Now, that's great, which means that we hit a peak. I think that the worst of the pandemic is behind us. I'm fairly confident that that's the case in terms of the labor market. Now, the troubling aspect of this is that you see that it's going down, and that's good. However, when you get to the bottom right of the graph and you compare those numbers to where we were pre-pandemic, we're still running at about 4 times the level of the pre-pandemic unemployment insurance claims, right? So what does that say? That says that, again, we are nowhere near return to normalcy. We're clearly not at the depths of where we were 8 months ago, 9 months ago, but how do we go from 4 times the level to just the level that we were at before, or growth? That's a big question mark, and that's where policy and that's where smart people like you need to start thinking about how do you allocate dollars, how do you get the economy humming again? And it's important to remember that the economy was not humming even before this, meaning we had those 3 years of recession. We had 2019 where we were growing, but growing fairly anemically. And now we got hit with this recession. So I think that there are big structural questions that need to be addressed. I don't have the answers to them, but I'm just kind of sharing context here. Similar statistic, but these are continuing claims rather than new unemployment insurance claims, and basically same shape of the graph, right? And so fairly low, we get this explosion in continuing claims. And the difference here is that these are people that have filed before and are continuing to receive payments. And again, peaked, dropped, and then we see a bit of a plateau, and that's kind of where we've been over the last few months, right? And so we're clearly nowhere near those levels in April 2020, but we're still in these levels, about twice as many claims as we had pre-pandemic. I get this question more than any other, and I know that there are strong opinions about it, and I know that people speak to businesses and they tell them that they're struggling to hire, and there is story after story in the Wall Street Journal. The research on an aggregate level, at least, really does not find any effect of the unemployment insurance, the federal unemployment insurance boosts on decisions to pursue work. So the reason I'm showing you this is that people look at those previous 2 slides and they say, well, of course we have this terrible labor market, nobody wants to work because they're getting more money from the federal government. That's true for it's true that some people were receiving more money from UI and from stimulus than they would have had from employment, but there are, by my count, about a dozen papers from different organizations that basically all reach the same conclusion. Because of the pandemic, there is very little association at the aggregate level between these extra boost of payments and the decision to seek employment. Now, just to be clear, this does not mean that there aren't employers that are struggling to find workers. Saying in an aggregate sense, that does not seem to hold in the data. Of course, this is going to vary by sector, by region, by pay, of course. So that's just one of those things that I think people think about a lot of, is a way to speed up the recovery, to cut some of these unemployment insurance. The research says no. So I'm going to pivot away from employment and then talk about personal income. I'm not going to read it for you, but I define it at the top of the page. And this is in billions of dollars. And so this is, again, personal income, which is a fairly exhaustive definition of the money that's floating in the economy or in people's bank accounts. And the thing that I will point to is transfer payments, right? So this includes transfer payments, and then typically that's Social Security and veterans benefits. Obviously, this time around, the most important transfers were boosted unemployment insurance, stimulus payments, and PPP to proprietors. And as a result of that, as I said a second ago, these transfers have exceeded the losses that were incurred in the labor market through reduction in earnings. So that's why you get the orange bar being higher than the teal bar, i.e. we have more personal income. Now, this is at an aggregate level. And one of the tricky things in these statistics is that in an aggregate sense, there is more money. Now, I come back again, and I'm a broken record at this stage, but I come back to the question of targeting, because not all the money that has flowed into the economy has gone towards people that have needed it, right? And so just because there is more money in the economy does not mean that there isn't pain, because as I showed you a second ago, there are 22,000 people that we have 22,000 fewer jobs than we did in 2019. We know that there are local governments that are struggling. So let's not interpret the fact that there is more personal income as everything is hunky-dory and that things are going to get back to normal once people are able to spend, because a lot of this money has gone into savings, a lot of this money has gone into the stock market, a lot of this money may or may not make it into the economy and is not necessarily going towards people that have lost jobs. And this is a decomposition that maybe I think helps for those of you that are still struggling about why personal income went up. So the teal bar on the left is that total that I showed you. That's the difference between 2020 and 2019. So we had basically $1.4 billion more than we did last year in personal income. How is that the case? The teal bar is the sum of the three other bars. So as you can see, we have this maroon bar here that's $1.9 billion, and that's the change in transfers between 2019 and 2020. And that was obviously much, much higher than the losses that we've experienced in net earnings and even in dividends. That's dividend receipts, because obviously a lot of companies cut dividends. And so you end up with this kind of different statistic. As I've said, we really have not had a recession where we are seeing statistics tell such different stories, but it's unsurprisingly because of the massive, aggressive fiscal aid that has been allocated towards individuals, firms, and governments. I want to kind of summarize and provide a bit of context before moving forward. This is not an Alaska-only story. This is a story that has played out in every state, right? Personal income has gone up in every single state because the dynamics that I was just explaining are basically the same, right? And so, again, no two states have experienced the recession the same way, but in every state, the amount of federal transfers has exceeded the losses on an aggregate basis. And in Alaska, we basically have personal income that is 3% higher than last year. But to get a sense of where we stack up, that increase is the third lowest in the country. The only two states that had lower growth in personal income were Wyoming and Connecticut. Not sure why Connecticut. Pivoting once again to a slightly different statistic now. So people typically think of GDP, or gross domestic product, the value of goods and services produced by businesses, and personal income as related, or as telling us similar things. Typically, they move fairly closely together. The big difference here, obviously, is that personal income has those big transfers. This does not. This is probably a better reflection of what's going on in the economy minus those transfers. So a couple of things. The 1, 2, 3, 4 at the bottom of the graph shows you quarterly numbers. So that's quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. These are numbers that have just been released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They're the ones that produce GDP for every state in the country. And as you can see, unsurprisingly, in Q2, that's the second quarter, that's the quarter that has April, May, and June, is when we saw the most significant losses. Again, that doesn't surprise anybody because we were in the depths of the lockdown. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was personal behavior had changed quite significantly. We've started bouncing back, meaning GDP in Q2 and Q3 looks better, but on an annualized basis, we are still at about 5% below where we were in 2019. And this is the point that I made a little while ago. And so for those of you that have reach and that have the ability to influence conversations, I think looking backwards is incredibly instructive in this case, because looking backwards, whether in the labor market or in GDP, tells you that the economy was just not growing very fast, right? And so, and if I were to go back to 2015, it would look even uglier. But what I'm showing you here is that in 2017, we were still going down in terms of real GDP. GDP turned the corner or became positive in 2018, sorry, before the labor market recovered. Because remember, in 2018, we were still shedding jobs. But GDP had turned positive, but it was essentially flat. In 2019, that was the very first year where we were firmly outside of or out of the oil-driven recession. And then, as you can see, basically this drop in GDP in 2020 erases, more than erases, the 2 years of gains that we had just had. And clearly we had even more losses if you go backwards. So I think, to me, based on these three statistics, it tells me that it's a complicated picture. It's one where we have some information. And again, I don't think, because personal income is higher, I think it's fairly obvious that just helicoptering more money in aggregate without targeting does not make a ton of sense. And I think it's unrealistic to think that just because personal income is higher, then the moment we're all vaccinated, then it's all going to drop on the Alaska economy and everything will be fine. I think that pent-up demand and higher savings are certainly going to help this recovery. But I don't think we're out of the woods. I don't think we have any signs that tell us that the recovery is just around the corner. And I know that people want to put the economy out of their minds in order to focus on the budget, but I'm not sure that you can do that, at least not for me. So GDP takeaways, again, GDP went down in every state. So just to summarize, personal income went up in every state, GDP went down in every state. The labor market is still struggling in just about every state. And the decline in Alaska's GDP was the 9th most pronounced when you compare it to the other states. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it's helpful for those of you that are trying to do the accounting exercise of how much money have Alaskans received. So these are my estimates. They're not perfect. But what I have done is I've taken the cost of the stimulus payments and then approximated how much Alaskans have received. The first row, or the round one, so these are each of the individual stimulus payment rounds, and then I have the dividend in there as well because it was received in the middle of these payments. We have near exact numbers for the first round. So Alaska received, or Alaskans received, near $600 million. You can see in the second and third columns who received them and how much was received. And then in the last column, I say how much would a family of 4 would have received contingent on full eligibility. So if you add up the 3 stimulus payments and the dividend, a little more than $2.5 billion has entered people's bank accounts over the last year. And if a family of 4 were eligible for all of them, again, contingent on full eligibility, they would have received a little more than $14,000. So that's the aggregate picture, if you will. Now, again, not everybody that received the payments lost jobs. Not everybody that received payments is pumping this money back into the economy. And I'll just show you a couple of pictures. I'm running long as always, but I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here about spending. So I've shown this in a few previous talks. One of the good things that's come out of this recession is that a lot of communities, a lot of organizations, academic and otherwise, have gotten access to near real-time spending data. It's not perfect, but this is showing spending data relative to January of 2020 in Alaska, or by consumers in Alaskan zip codes. And as you can see, spending just dropped significantly once the pandemic hit. You see I have there 2 vertical lines indicating when the stimulus payments occurred, first and second round of stimulus payments. And then we see a fairly sharp rebound right around that first stimulus payment. We don't really see as clear of an increase in the second stimulus. I'm not making causal interpretations here, just telling you that there is some evidence that the consumer spending responded to the stimulus payments. And in fact, there are a couple of papers that take this data and other granular data, and they try to estimate the response specifically. What I want to show you here, and the reason I'm showing you this graph, is that we basically have this whole year where consumer spending was well below, just again, to be clear, this is spending data relative to January 2020. So we spent a whole year where spending was well below where it was the year before. We're just now kind of hovering around where we were a year ago. How this moves forward is contingent and dependent on everything that I've been talking about thus far. Small business revenue, kind of a different side of the same coin, also shows some response to the payments, not as robust. And the research really shows that small business revenues, depending on the zip codes where they're located, either did not benefit from the stimulus payments or benefited some, but the bump was temporary, meaning people take some portion of their stimulus payment, or a portion of the recipients spend some money from their stimulus payments. And I'll show you why. Again, not terribly surprising. People that were cash strapped got stimulus payments, used them to pay rent or to pay for utilities or to pay for bills or groceries. People that kept their jobs, even though they may not be high income, really did not use much of that stimulus payments, and instead it ended up going towards savings. This is just a summary. I'm not going to read it for you, but again, it basically says what I was just talking about a second ago. I really like that first paper. You can click on it and look at the details. They used very, very granular data, and they found that within 10 days of the first stimulus payments, people basically spent about 29 cents out of every dollar that was received. And you can see what things it went on, what things they allocated money towards. And then the second paper uses some of that data that I showed you, the granular version of it. And they found that a lot of the money did get spent, but by whom? It got spent by low-income households. Why? Because they were cash strapped. They did not have cash reserves, which means it was money in, money out, because they needed to pay bills. One more bit of research that I think most of you know, and if you had to guess, you would know this. You can see there are bars there that are different colors. This is from the Pulse survey from the census. What does this tell us? By the way, the Pulse survey is this experimental program that the Census Bureau created. There is an Alaska version of this survey. It's based on small samples, so I'm not showing it to you. I'm showing you numbers from the federal government, but these show us the share of households by income that did different things with their stimulus payments. So if we focus on the dark blue bars, that's paid for expenses. And surprisingly, as you go up in the income distribution, meaning as you go from people making less than 25,000 to basically 200,000, the share of households that use the stimulus to pay for expenses shrinks. And if you now go to the red bars, what share of households used it to go towards savings? It's the opposite, right? And so fewer households that were low income used it to go towards savings if they're low income. And that number starts, or that percentage starts to go up as you go up in the income distribution. So that explains to you a little bit as to why this money is not just being pumped into the Fred Meyers and the Walmarts, and why we're not seeing the same type of activity at a retail level whenever we get stimulus payments. We get some, but not everybody is spending it because not everybody was as cash poor before the payments. I'm going to skip this. This is a summary of what we know about the PFD. I think most of you are familiar with this work. Some of it is ours, meaning ISO researchers, myself and others. Some of it is from other researchers. The PFD, like these stimulus payments, causes an increase in spending in the short run. We find increases in employment in two separate papers, but both of those increases are fairly contained in the months post-distribution. And then I'm just going to leave this here and I'm going to stop because we're right around 8:45. PPP, I know that people liked it. I think that it helped a lot of businesses. The research is all over the place. The numbers that were touted at the beginning of PPP program were that it saved 51 million jobs. At the state level, the numbers were it saved about 114,000. How did we get to these numbers? Well, when people were filing for PPP, they were asked how many jobs would be preserved if they were to receive these payments. And if you tally those up, you get gigantic numbers. I think of these numbers as how many jobs PPP supported as opposed to how many jobs would have disappeared in the absence of PPP. So the research is kind of cautious in attributing a lot of the jobs saved to PPP. And the main reason is, again, one of targeting, that a lot of the PPP money ended up going at the national level to fairly large organizations, ones that would have preserved jobs anyway. So this, by the way, does not mean that we should not be helping businesses or that we should not be allocating money towards mitigating business failure. I personally think we should. It just means that isolating what's the effective use of dollars is incredibly difficult. And I don't think we should be making aggregate decisions. I think we should be making decisions that are targeted by industry, by region, by need. So I'm just going to stop. I don't think there is, this is a slide on the child tax credit. Massively important, but temporary. And you can see here what I know about it. The feature that matters the most, or two features that matter most, is the child tax credit is fully refundable, unlike what we previously had, meaning people will actually receive money. And then the second feature, which potentially can help with the Alaska recovery, is that there are advanced payments. And that's a fairly important feature, meaning that people will be receiving money, not when they file for taxes, but they will be, if the Biden administration gets the IRS to comply. They said that they think that the schedule is far too optimistic. What they want is they want payments to start in July and end in December. So if things go according to plan, families contingent on eligibility could potentially be receiving $250 per child per month from July to December. And that's obviously for a low income family, a big quote unquote raise. So that's it. I'm gonna stop and yeah. Feel free to reach out by email if you don't want to ask a question.
Okay. So we have some questions and I'm just going to walk through some of them. I'll go in reverse order here. Gunnar asks, does the scale of the federal helicopter payments to Alaskans suggest that a large PFD is not particularly advisable or effective to help the Alaska economy overall?
Yeah, I think that given the big constraints that the state is facing, I think, again, I've said it a slightly different way in that I think a targeted approach makes the most sense, right? And so, because if you're thinking about the PFD as a way to help the economy recover, you're thinking about the multiplier effect. And as I've shown, dollars that are coming in when they go to households that don't need them right now are not necessarily making it into the economy. So something like boosting unemployment insurance for people that need them, or helping local governments, or helping local businesses potentially makes more sense once you identify exactly that need. As opposed to just giving 80% of us have been lucky enough to not lose jobs. And so as bad as things are, the majority of people have kept jobs and are in better financial condition than they were a year ago. And that's just the unfortunate situation we're in.
Great. Okay. The great economist conundrum in Alaska, the jobs issue for the fishing sector. Obviously, we're able to show impacts in manufacturing, seafood processing, but any chance that there's any other breakout information? This from Matt Tyning.
Yes, so what I'm showing you is wage and salary jobs, right? And so these are W-2 jobs. I think that some of the other people at ICER are more in tune with fishing numbers. We obviously, when you don't have W-2s, it's much harder to produce monthly statistics. And so I'm relying here on numbers that we can trust. Doesn't mean that the fishing sector did not get affected, because it shows up even in processing, as you said. But yeah, it's one of those things where you go, sorry, but not really able to say very much.
Yeah. Well, you know, the saddest thing for an economist is not to have the right data set. So
no, I'm happy to acknowledge that. I've lost all of my ego, but yeah, that's fine.
Heather Flynn's asking, you know, seniors didn't have to take their required minimum distributions and, you know, had fewer places to spend their money. So do you think that contributed? How did it contribute in terms of wealth and income for this period?
I think that, I mean, the interesting thing here is that, as I've said, whether you think about seniors not taking distributions as savings going up or not, I think that there is wealth accumulation, right? And so that has happened, right? And so a lot of us typically take trips or spend money on services, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think there is going to be a faster rebound in services than there will be in goods, because most of us basically shied away from engaging in the service economy. And so some of that money is going to get reallocated towards services, and it's going to happen fairly fast once we're all comfortable aggregating. However, again, the $1 million questions that every CEO around the country is grappling with is which of the changes that have occurred are temporary and which are permanent, right? And so when you talk about people having nice savings or having a bigger bank account, are they going to fall in love with that and change their patterns permanently? Or are people, again, I mean, the thing that I don't think we talk about enough is we talk about tourism negatively affecting Alaska, meaning lack of tourism negatively affecting Alaska, but we don't know how much of this money that's been saved will end up being spent outside of Alaska, right? And so as people start traveling again, and as people have had to cancel, so there are, I think it's important to acknowledge the unknowns, but to answer the question directly, I think that seniors are, I hate to say this and I always cringe, a big economic engine for the state of Alaska, because during the recessions, their incomes do not get hit as hard, right? And so it's become an economic base, if you will. This time around, again, that's a group that was not negatively affected by the recession. In fact, because of the performance of the stock market, those that have 401ks have actually benefited. So I think that there is no doubt that having this base is going to help in this recovery, just that we don't know how exactly.
Right. You know, I have a question for you, maybe sort of lessons from the past, and there's two parts to it. You know, during the 2008 Great Recession, the recovery was really a 10-year process, and that there was by most estimates, serious wage stagnation during that time period. And so are there things from, and I'll just add to that prior economic cycles also showed this recovery cycle continuing to lengthen. What lessons should we take from that in terms of how this is going to impact employment long term?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. The jobless recovery that we had, I mean, it was a jobless recovery after 2008, and you were talking about wages, but we had a jobless recovery for a phase, and then once jobs did come back, wages did not. And so I think that what's different this time around, and this is a federal response or a response that kind of takes into account the federal action, is that the Federal Reserve seems to have zeroed in on inequality, on wage growth. And if you believe Jerome Powell, he said multiple times that the Fed is not going to let its foot off the gas till they see real numbers of recovery, right? And so we've never heard that, right? Typically, the Fed makes decisions based on forecasts, meaning the moment they see that inflation is heating up or that jobs are going to come back, they start scaling down. What typically happens when that occurs is that you have K-shaped type recoveries, kind of what you were hinting, meaning low income, highly educated people recover, get plugged into jobs, and then there are people that are left behind. What I've heard him say multiple times, and this is reading the tea leaves, is that he starts breaking down employment or unemployment. Female unemployment, African-American unemployment, low income, leisure and hospitality. The moment I think he says that, what he's communicating, at least to me, is that policy is going to be a lot more flexible in order to make sure that we don't leave sectors behind, we don't leave portions of the economy behind. At the state level, I think what we really should not do, in my opinion, is that we should not let budgetary problems end up driving austerity type decisions which are going to negatively affect the economy. To me, that's the concern number one, right? Is that there are these competing interests. Obviously, we've been talking about the budget for multiple years, and people want to put the budget conversations behind us. But at least based on what I know, the economy is not going to organically recover tomorrow. And I think that there needs to be coordinated efforts with communities, with businesses, to try and figure out what are the short-term needs, and then to directly answer your question is, what are structural things that need to be done? Because I think we're at a stage where we absolutely need to be thinking about Alaska 2.0 or 3.0, or some of you that know Alaska better than I do know we're maybe at 5.0, because the economic drivers that most of us are familiar with have changed, and we have an economy that's been hovering around that 0% growth, and there is a lot that's changed. So I think that the bigger conversation around economic development, I'm sure it's happening, but needs better coordination, in my humble opinion.
Yes. Well, I mean, and to that point, I guess what I hear you saying is that the toolbox that we've had are mostly blunt instruments, and what you're suggesting is that something more granular needs to happen, either targeted regionally or sectorally within the economy. So, I mean, I think that's some important advice, that it would be good to see some shift in the economic policies and economic development strategies to move in that direction. Along those lines too, and again, this lessons from the past kind of question, of course, with the Great Depression, then we came at, with the coming out, the Roaring '20s came out of an economic recession, and of course ended that decade with the worst economic circumstances prior to this. So I mean, I'm sure some of the things that you're suggesting, that the Fed keeping an eye on issues and keeping the pedal down until there's some signs of real recovery. What should we be looking for in terms of long-term policy to make sure that we're coming out of this with some hope for a stable recovery?
I think that the competing narratives are the Fed doesn't understand inflation, and that inflation is going to end up burning us. Meaning that if the Fed is being too accommodative, and if they let the economy run too hot, then inflation can potentially pose long-term problems for growth. I'm not in that camp, to be honest with you. I think that the Fed is fully equipped to deal with inflation. That's not to ignore the fact that what's happening in the housing market is really troubling. And I know people think that it's great that housing prices are going up, but I'm not entirely sure that that's really the story. So what should we be looking out for? I think it's the two things you touched on. It's how fast do jobs come back? How fast are wages again starting to grow? Are we leaving people behind, sectors behind, regions behind? And then I think more importantly, how much scarring do we have? So long-term unemployment is a massive problem that's very hard to fix, both at the state and at the national level. And so we really need to make sure that we're thinking structurally about, I don't want to say retraining because it's one of those jokes in economic circles, but the economy is changing so fast that if the economy has left people behind, we need to make sure that we are allowing these transitions into the new sectors. I've heard multiple numbers like, oh, the pandemic has accelerated digitization by 5 years, by 10 years. If that's the case, skills are not keeping up with that digitization, right? And so skill acquisition is part of this story. And that's a part of Alaska economic policy that needs to happen, meaning I always rail, Alaska does not have a diversification problem. It has a leakage problem. It's a lot of money leaks out of the state. How do you stop money leaking out? Well, you have a workforce that's equipped to take some of those jobs, and you have better linkages across sectors. That requires money. That requires, again, that big vision economic development that I talked about a second ago. And again, that needs to happen now, even though we're dealing with pressing issues, meaning you can't say, oh, we need to plug the holes now, and in 2 years we'll address these things, because it'll be too late.
Yeah, definitely, I think workforce training and moving people towards in-demand occupations for the future. One of the things that's difficult with an economy that's transitioning the way that Alaska's has, and people anticipating even more sort of dramatic shifts, perhaps with energy, is how the tax structure, the things that support civil society and government are not in place for those new industries. And in fact, those new industries may not be viable if they have to bear that tax load. So how do we navigate that in terms of coming up with the new economic development strategies?
Well, as much distaste as some people have for government, that's where subsidies, that's why, taking advantage of, for example, the Biden Green Plan is something that needs to be done in coordination with what's happening at the federal level, right? And so you can't wait for the transition to occur in order to jump on board, right? And so you have to make investments, right? And the thing that I almost always suggest at the end of these talks, and I know people hate it, is, look, the state has the permanent fund. At what point does the permanent fund make investments in pivoting the economy in a different direction? I know people dislike that suggestion, but look, there are constraints. We have some resources. We have some say in what the economy looks like. Tax is a portion of it. It's not the biggest part of it. Businesses and individuals make decisions on where to locate for a lot of different reasons. Taxes are one of them. In no papers are they found to be the main driver. Not suggesting that 90% taxes are the right answer, but I think it's it's workforce development, it's attractiveness of place, it's again having enough linkages across sectors and being forward looking. And so if it's green energy, then it's green energy. And then the other thing that's, I'll just close with this, is investing in new areas or sub areas of existing sectors does not mean abandoning the old way. starting out a brand new sector is one of the hardest things that any economy can do, but reinventing it or making sure you capture more money from it or doing things a slightly different way is a much more feasible and applicable way. Meaning you already have an oil and gas sector. If you're thinking about green energy, you have a lot of the infrastructure that you can use. You have a lot of things that can happen. You have tourism and a lot of that money leaks out. You can figure out how more locals own a piece of the pie, or that more locals are employed in those institutions. So I think that there are lower hanging fruit that can be done, and I'm sure are being done to a smaller scale. But when you're talking about coming out of a recession and reimagining an economy, it takes bold policy choices, and those, for the most part, they're going to require money. And where is the money going to come from?
Well, I'll leave you with one last question. Assembly member John Weddleton is online with us today, and he has made the statement that, you know, the granular allocation of recovery or stimulus funds is tough when, you know, you're governing a community of 280,000 people or so, and everybody knows what their pain points are. And he says, you know, the Assembly is actively looking at what to do with $50 million right now. So yeah. I'm going to pose the question to you. What advice would you give them in terms of using that $50 million for Anchorage?
I think that it's businesses and people that have been negatively affected by the pandemic. So I think that those are the two places that make the most sense, right? And so it's whether it's in job placement, whether it's paying a portion of the wage for an employer that's going to hire somebody. So it's like matching, playing matchmaker makes a lot of sense, right? And so there are a lot of states that are experimenting with how do you get an unemployed person to get hired? Does the muni pay 3 months of pay while demand is coming back? And then, you know, if you have businesses that are on the fringe, I think that business failure can potentially cripple a recovery. So whatever we can do to not have vacant commercial property, not have businesses that go under, I think is going to be really good return on investment. Because the moment you have that, again, you get into long-term unemployment, you get into how do you restart businesses, which is much harder coming out of a recession. So I know that there is a lot of need. I know granularity is complicated, but inefficiency of allocation is also problematic, right? And so, I'm not suggesting there is an easy solution, but to me, the people, so identifying need is not that hard, and thinking a little creatively about this kind of job placement may make a lot of sense, and there are resources that I'm happy to share about how some states are thinking about some of these matching programs.
Great. Well, thank you, Mouhcine. I'm going to turn back to Cheryl. We're a little bit over time, and ask her to have any closing remarks. You're on mute, Cheryl.
Yep. So few people have ever said that. But Mouhcine, thank you so very much.
Yeah, of course.
And really appreciate your observations, your insights, and very thought-provoking in terms of policy decisions. And this reminds me, with John Weddleton, we really appreciate your listening in today and your question. And Juanetta, we might want to invite John or whoever else from the Municipal Assembly to come and the administration to share with us what their thoughts are, what they're thinking in terms of follow-up to Mouhcine's insight. So to everyone, thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to have you participate, and we've got a session scheduled next Friday, so hope to see you then. And if you have a chance, listen in on Ways and Means Committee on Thursday to see how the members of the House on that committee respond to our budget choices. So thank you, Juanetta, for a great job once again, and have a great week, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.